Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Yes, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for the last part of the Courage and Resistance Tour. We're really excited to be hosting this wonderful, stellar panel here this evening. And this is actually the conclusion of our MLK week. And so we've been really excited to bring to the campus a number of events that are, sorry, I'm just going to still adjust this. A number of events that are celebrating and asking us to really think critically about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. So I think this is a very fitting way to end that series. I'm not going to talk too much, but I would just like to thank my colleagues for helping us put this on. It was a collective effort, and this was part of a 10 location tour, 7 location tour. And so this is truly an example of collaboration amongst institutions and amongst colleagues, and we're really honored to be part of that. So I would like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Sharon Kyle, who is a publisher of the LA Progressive and also a law professor at the People's College of Law. So please give a round of applause for Ms. Sharon Kyle.
Thank you so much, Ella, and welcome everyone to our final leg of the Courage and Resistance campaign tour. As she said, my name is Sharon Kyle, and I am so delighted that so many of you have turned up to hear these brave people, people that I consider my heroes, tell you their story and talk about how their story has a direct impact on your lives and, in fact, the lives of all Americans. I'd like to thank Occidental College for hosting this event and the staff and the students that volunteered to get the word out and to set up the room and all of the volunteering that they did. And I'd like to especially thank the Assistant Dean of Community Engagement, Ella Tureen, which I guess she's already left the room. Thank you so much, Ella. Ella has been a key member of our organizing group. Now let me just set the expectations, tell you what you're in store for tonight. Before we begin our discussion with these distinguished panelists, we're going to have a representative from the ACLU to talk about current surveillance. So we're going to be starting this evening talking about what's happening today in 2015 and why it is so important that each and every one of you take a stand against inappropriate surveillance. And then we're going to go all the way back to 1971, before many of you were born, and we're going to be talking about how surveillance was conducted back then and how it was uncovered and disclosed. And then I'm going to be introducing the panel and acknowledging the organizers and co-sponsors. But before I do that, and before Jessica talks to you, oh, and finally, there will be an opportunity to purchase this wonderful book written by the author, Betty Medsger, who is sitting here at the table, and she will be signing books at the end of this talk. I want to talk to you a little bit about what led to this evening.
She wants to tell you something. Sorry, just if anybody needs to go to the restroom, the ladies' restroom is on this floor and the men's restroom is on the 3rd floor. And also for students, there's a few sign-in sheets going around. Please make sure that you sign them. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't know where the restrooms were, because if I knew, I'd actually be there. So let me tell you about the series of events that led up to this evening and this week. One of my long-term colleagues and friends, Mr. Bob Nelson, and Bob, if you would just raise your hand, stand up. Bob Nelson. He is actually the single most responsible person for this happening. Bob Nelson read the book, The Burglary, and he wrote a piece in the Pasadena Weekly. And as a result of his piece, where he was just really talking about how fantastic this book is, I'm telling you, it'll keep you at the end of your seat, at the edges of your seats. There's somebody in the audience that's read it twice. So Bob wrote in the Pasadena Weekly, and Betty Medsger, the author of the book, contacted Bob and said thank you. And so then he established a communication with her and said, well, we would love, when you come out to California for your book tour, we'd love to get together and maybe have a beer or a glass of wine. And she said that there is no book tour. And that was it. Bob said, what? So Bob called together. So Bob organized a small group of people, and that group of people were Bob Nelson and his wife, Peggy, and Peggy, I have your name here because I've been calling you Peggy all along, but it's Peggy Renner, Susan Foster and Robert Kitana, my husband Dick Price, who is the editor of the LA Progressive, and myself, and Ella Terrain. And we worked together to try to bring this, to make this a reality, along with the co-sponsor, the ACLU, and the staff of the ACLU, which is Miguel Cruz, Jessica Farris, Elvia Mesa, Marcos Benigno, and a special honor goes to ACLU intern Sydney Tupper, who did an outstanding job herding cats. Because I've already listed a bunch of people, so you can imagine we're from different organizations, we live in different cities, and this intern just did a yeoman's job pulling it all together. But when Bob told me about the book and how it exposed COINTELPRO, I said, you know, Bob, it would be remiss of us to not include people who were directly harmed by what COINTELPRO did. And so we have with us 2 former Black Panthers. So now I will go into the introductions of our speakers, and then we will have Jess Farris. Jess, where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay, and then Jess is going to get up and talk a little bit about this report. So tonight we have with us, seated directly to my right, is Ms. Bonnie Rains. She is an educator and a member of the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. I love that. We also have Betty Medsger. Ms. Medsger was formerly a reporter with the Washington Post, and she is the author of this book, The Burglary, The Discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's Secret FBI. Seated to Ms. Medsger's right is Harold Taylor. Harold is a former member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and Harold comes to us from Florida. He flew in specifically to talk to you tonight about the impact that COINTELPRO had on his life back then in the early 70s and to this day. And finally, Mr. Hank Jones. Hank Jones is a longtime activist, civil rights activist, former member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and also a victim of the illegal activities of the FBI. So before we get into the discussion of this panel, I would like to bring Jess Farris up. Here's Jess Farris with the ACLU.
All right, well, I hate to stand between you and these heroes. I don't even want to hear myself talk right now, but I'll be very brief so we can get to it. I just want to take a moment to pull the issues that they are going to be talking about into the present day and in California. Right now, across California, local law enforcement is taking advantage of millions of federal surveillance dollars streaming into the state. They're sidestepping normal oversight processes of city councils and boards of supervisors, and they're keeping the public often completely in the dark about very important community surveillance decisions. 40 California counties and 50 of the state's largest cities have spent more than $65 million on surveillance in the last decade. Few have engaged the public, few have disclosed the policies they'll use to prevent misuse. In fact, only 5 out of 90 communities with surveillance, 5 out of 90, hosted any sort of public debate for each invasive technology, and only 1 in 5 made their policies available. So that means that devices ranging from drones to automated license plate readers to IMSI catchers or stingrays, and for those of you who don't know what those are, they're creepy devices that emulate cell phone towers and then can gobble up the information around and the content of your emails, phone calls, internet activity, texts, whatever you're doing on your cell phone. That means that devices like these are often secretly acquired by law enforcement and then covertly unleashed on the public. And this should never happen. So to help communities ask and answer the right questions about surveillance, the ACLU of California has put together a report called Making Smart Decisions About Surveillance, a guide for communities. We've got it available at our table, which is outside this little hall. And one of the very coolest aspects of this report to me is that it comes with a model ordinance. There it is. And this model ordinance will ensure that there's robust public debate every single time any sort of surveillance technology is considered, that local lawmakers will actually approve each and every step, and that if any surveillance technology actually is approved and goes forward, it'll come with a surveillance use policy, which will safeguard civil liberties and the oversight and accountability and transparency mechanisms to make sure that those policies are actually followed. So that means that surveillance will not be able to be secretly used or misused or as susceptible to mission creep, which is a very troubling phenomenon that we see throughout California. I'll give two very brief examples. One, in San Jose, the police department said to City Council, we want to acquire a drone only for hazardous material investigations. So if there is a, thank you, that is hilarious. It's laughable. So they're saying if there's a bomb in a parking lot somewhere, we want to send a drone out instead of a police officer to just check it out, see if it really is a bomb, dismantle and destroy it. However, they then, in the dark, behind closed doors, unilaterally decided that they were actually going to use the drone for any situation that might affect public safety. So that's every police situation. It's absurd. Another good example from Southern California are these IMSI catchers or stingrays, which were originally purchased with the justification of fighting terrorism, which itself was already problematic, but now it appears they're being used for everyday, ordinary law enforcement. So this kind of latitude and this mission creep really shows that surveillance uses can rapidly expand and can also devolve into warrantless mass surveillance if we're not careful and if we don't have very good oversight and accountability and transparency mechanisms in place. And finally, this awesome ordinance would make it so that law enforcement and the government has to disclose surveillance technology that it already has. And why this is great is that if we're not in the dark, if we know what we actually are being surveilled with, we can evaluate it and we can fight it, as opposed to right now when we don't even know what's happening. So the bottom line is that an ordinance would ensure that the right process is followed every single time and that communities have a say in how the time and the energy and the resources in their community are being spent, and a chance to determine whether ineffective and expensive and possibly overly intrusive technology will actually create more problems than they solve. The concerns that we will hear about tonight have not gone away. Surveillance is still used all the time in ways that violate our constitutional rights and our civil rights. It can be used to religiously and racially profile us. Even the perceived threat of surveillance can discourage political activity, and activity that is clearly protected by our state and federal constitutions. Bottom line is that we, the people, need to keep an eye on the government's use of surveillance. And so here's where we're hoping that you can help, because this is happening in your backyard right now. We have a card at our table back there, and it looks a little something like this. Thank you. It looks like this. And perfect. We've got a place where you can check that you will help efforts to pass an ordinance in your town or community. If you've not done this before, or if you feel alone, don't worry about it. I will connect you with other people who are doing the same work. If it's just you, I will guide you every step of the way. We've got a ton of resources, a toolkit, and I personally will help determine what the process should be in your town or community. I'll help strategize. We also have a box where you can add your organization to a sign-on letter that we're letting advocates bring to various city council and board of supervisor meetings to say, hey, look at this broad support we have for an ordinance. And lastly, we have a box to sign up for events like these, or if you just want to be updated about surveillance technology. So, thank you. Last point, is that as we all continue to weigh the merits and the dangers of surveillance, we are hoping that everyone will basically remember these lessons of the past. We're hoping that people will see tonight as a reason to stay on the paths of these heroes, that people will see that tonight and our current need for transparency is not novel to our time, but is a continuation of struggles that we have all struggled with to protect our civil rights against government excess. And I hope personally that you will remember to fill out this card and that I'll see you out in the hallway. Hold on to that, because I promise you these people are way more inspiring than I am. So after you're all inspired, go out there, fill out a card, and with that, I will turn it over. Thank you so much.
I knew that we would find things in that office that were not only immoral, but probably illegal.
What we thought of at the time as the war machine, we wanted to do as much damage to it as we could before we got caught.
We knew that if we got caught, we were going to probably face very serious prison time.
It was very empowering to know that ordinary people could actually take action. Philadelphia was full of young families just like ourselves who were very active politically.
I was ready to make a transition from nonviolent protest to nonviolent disruption.
If the FBI was suppressing dissent, it was as important to expose that as it was to end the war.
So many things were so wrong. There was no decision to be made. You have to do something.
More than 1,000 documents were stolen from the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania.
They called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI.
These documents reveal illegal activity by the FBI.
Surveillance of people engaged in protected First Amendment activity.
The fortress was under siege.
150 agents were looking for us. My worry was that what would happen to those 3 kids?
This was quite a substantial risk they took.
They risked everything. They saw injustice and decided that they were going to act on it.
So that was the official trailer for a film entitled 1971. This film will debut next month in New York, March 13th. Look for it in California sometime after that. But the film covers the story of Bonnie and John Raines and the 8 other individuals, people that would think unlikely to be called burglars. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Bonnie Raines, and Bonnie, I want you to tell the audience, if you could, and just briefly, what they just saw. And then I have some specific questions.
Well, in 1970, the war was raging, and we lived in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was the center of much of the protest against the war, as well as some continuing activism around civil rights issues. And some of us banded together to resist the draft and disrupt the draft if we possibly could, as one way to stop the war machine. And our strategy was to break into draft boards in the middle of the night and remove draft files and destroy them, because at that time it was just a paper system, and if you destroyed the paper, you perhaps weren't going to send some young men to war in Vietnam. And that was definitely civil disobedience. And we realized after that time, and with increasing protests against the war and increasing frustration with our voices not being heard and the war becoming more and more horrific, that there were FBI agents in our midst, and they were everywhere. It was a massive effort of surveillance and intimidation to break the peace movement. We knew that it was going on all over the Philadelphia area, primarily much of it on college and university campuses. So we were very concerned about that kind of effort to suppress dissent, which is our constitutional right. I think we should all remind ourselves that we have a right to dissent in this democracy. But there wasn't any way to prove what J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was doing. It was all very secret, and there was no information in the press about what the FBI was doing. And one of our leaders, Bill Davidon, a leader in the anti-war movement and a brilliant physics professor at Haverford College, pulled a handful of us together who'd gone into draft boards and asked us if we would like to think about breaking into an FBI office to obtain documentation. Yeah, pretty novel, huh? Because it would be the only way that we could reveal what we knew was going on and was depriving people of their First Amendment rights. After considering the idea and looking at a possible office in an apartment building in a small town outside of Philadelphia called Media, we thought that it was reasonable to plan to try to do that. And we took all the necessary steps. It was an apartment building and a very quiet little town, and we thought that if we did our planning meticulously and our casing to see what the activity was in and around the building, that we could probably select a night that would be the night that we would break in and remove the documents. So it took a great deal of planning and patience for 8 of us who finally made the commitment to do this. And my role to get the last piece of information before we could commit to doing this kind of an action was to get inside the office during the day to see if there were any security measures. And I called and asked to have an appointment with the office because I said I was a student at Swarthmore College and was interested in information about opportunities for women in the FBI. There are many opportunities out there. This was a good one for me because they gave me the appointment and I had an interview with the head of the office. I tried to disguise my appearance as much as I could. I was 29 at the time. And it gave me enough time to see that there were no security measures in the office whatsoever. And the file cabinets were not even locked. And we probably, with the help of the member of our group who had trained as a lock picker, we could probably get through the door from the hallway into the office. And we were successful in doing that on the night of March 8th. You call my time if you need to say, wrap it up, and I'm home. You've got 1 more minute. 1 more minute. Sure enough. So we chose the night of March 8th, 1971 because that was the night of a huge boxing championship match between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. And we thought that probably the people in the apartment building would be listening to the fight that night, and including the building manager who lived right below the FBI office. And probably the police would not be as vigilant that night. They might be listening to the fight. And it was right. That was a correct guess. And that gave us the opportunity to break into the office. 4 of us remove every document, approximately 1,000 documents, and put them into suitcases and walk out of the building unsuspected and drive away.
It's awesome. I mean, that's just awesome. I mean, right? Now, Bonnie, that was a very brave and courageous thing for any 29-year-old to do, but a 29-year-old with 3 children. What kind of, what informed your activism? What had you done earlier, or what had your husband done earlier that made you feel that this was something that just had to be done?
Well, I should start with our activities in the civil rights movement. My husband, and I'm sorry he can't be here, he was here until yesterday and had to teach his class at Temple University today. Very conscientious professor. He was a freedom rider in 1961 and was arrested in Little Rock, Arkansas, and then went south 2 more times, including the March in Selma. So our activism started during the civil rights movement, and we were aware at that time that the FBI was not particularly interested in seeing that movement succeed. In fact, probably would have just as soon seen the streets get quiet again and segregation continue. They were not protecting civil rights workers, and we saw that. We saw that for ourselves during the civil rights movement. Then when we moved to Philadelphia and joined the anti-war movement, we carried out all the activities that probably a lot of you in this room did to try to stop that terrible, terrible war. We marched on the streets, we had rallies, we took buses to Washington, we signed petitions, and it was not making any difference. The war was worsening and our voices were not heard. And not only were our voices not heard, but there was an effort to squash the peace movement and end it all. And we were very aware of that, and I think from speaking for myself, I was very frustrated, I was angry, but I also felt the need to band together with others to take a different kind of step, another kind of, not just civil disobedience, but civil disruption. We did have 3 children under 10 at the time, so it was a huge decision for both my husband and myself to participate together. We knew the risks, we definitely knew the jeopardy, but we were careful, we were not reckless, we were meticulous in our planning, and we felt that because you are parents, you don't stop being citizens, and we saw some things that were terribly, terribly wrong, and we thought perhaps we could have a role in stopping Mr. Hoover and the tactics that his FBI was using. So I think we felt a certain empowerment. We also had a community around us. We had a wonderful community of resistance that supported us, and that was a different situation at that time. I think we had a sense of being part of a movement and a community that was going to support us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on now to Betty, who is the author of The Burglary, the discoverer of J. Edgar Hoover's secret FBI. And on the back of the book, it says, ordinary people have the courage and community to defeat the most powerful and punitive of institutions, including the FBI. That's the unbelievable but true story told by Betty Medsger, the only writer these long-term and brave conspirators trusted to tell it. The burglary will keep you on the edge of your seat right up until you stand up and cheer. Gloria Steinem. So, I think we all owe you a debt of gratitude and thank you for your courage and for your skill in telling this story in such a comprehensive way. So, Betty, you walked into your office on March 23rd, 1971 at the Washington Post, and there was a mysterious package there waiting for you. Tell us briefly about that package, and then if you could, tell us something about the other outlets that also received that package on that day.
Thank you. If I may also say something about the atmosphere of the time as far as J. Edgar Hoover was concerned. It's probably hard for people who weren't alive at that time to imagine a public official, elected or appointed, he was appointed, who was adored as much as J. Edgar Hoover was. He's probably been the most adored official this country has ever had, certainly in the past century. And the American public thought that he was their great protector and respected him a great, great deal. Bill Davidon, this mild-mannered physics professor who got the idea for burglarizing the FBI, always had the public in mind. He wanted to do actions that would be effective. And so one of his ideas was that even with the public loving J. Edgar Hoover as they did, if we found evidence, documentary evidence, that the FBI was doing what the activists thought the FBI was doing, but had no evidence to show that that was happening. If you could do that, the public would react, and that is what happened. Now, on the morning that you're talking about, I arrived at my office and I had the usual stack of mail, which is usually mostly press releases. But there was a special large envelope that the return address was Liberty Publications, Media, Pennsylvania. And I had a brief memory that I had seen something about an FBI office being burglarized, but there was only one paragraph in the Washington Post, and the most that had been in any newspaper up until that time, I think, were 2 paragraphs. And so the reporters had found out about it and asked the FBI in Media, Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and they said, oh yes, there was a burglary, a few things missing, nothing important. And you may know from Bonnie, everything was missing. They took every file. So, when I received that morning, I opened the envelope, and the first file on the top was a cover letter, actually, from the people who called themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI. Isn't that a nice name? They chose that name because they thought they wanted to give this air of being a proper group that should have been appointed by a president or a Congress, congressional committee, something like that. And they did more work than such a committee would have done. And it informed me that they had removed these files and that they had sorted through them, and that they now hoped that I would be interested in making the information in the files available to the public. Would you like for me to describe those files?
Okay, so why don't you spend about 30 seconds describing files, but I'm going to ask you some specific things about them. Yes, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, the files describe both what the FBI was doing, but also a sort of basic philosophy of operation, which the first file I read instructed FBI agents to behave in such a way that they would, quote, enhance the paranoia and make people feel that there was an FBI agent behind every mailbox. And that was a kind of stunning thing to see. It actually made me feel maybe it was a hoax. I continued reading, and the other files described the people that were hired on campuses to be FBI informers, switchboard operators to listen to professors' calls, postal delivery people on campuses, mid-level administrators. And on the Swarthmore campus, every black student was under surveillance, and a file had been developed and was continuing to grow. And that was a clue to an enormous thread that ran through all the files, and I guess we can come back to that later. And you wanted me to mention the other news organizations.
That's right. The other news organizations, who were they, and what did they do with the files that they received?
Okay, and Congress. The burglars sent out 5 sets of these initial files to 3 journalists and to 2 members of Congress. The 2 members of Congress were Senator George McGovern and Representative Perrin Mitchell, member of Congress from Baltimore. And the 2 members of Congress had received them the day before the journalists did. And the members of Congress held press conferences, separate press conferences, and announced that they had received these files, and yes, they raised some serious questions, but they didn't want to have anything to do with them because they had been stolen and that they had given them to the FBI. So I didn't realize until I did my investigation in the process of researching the book that 2 other journalists had received the files. A reporter at one set was addressed to a reporter at the Los Angeles Times, the great investigative reporter Jack Nelson, and Tom Wicker, a columnist at the New York Times Washington Bureau. And they also gave them back to the FBI the day they received them. But that deserves an explanation. And that Jack Nelson was the only reporter at that time who had done any investigative work about the FBI. And it wasn't a great volume of work, but it was significant, and Hoover was enraged. And at that time, I learned that I was doing research for my book, Hoover was engaged in a fierce campaign to get Jack Nelson fired. And someone, obviously part of that campaign in the Washington office, intercepted his mail, saw that, what that was, and immediately called the FBI and said, I'm delivering this to you. And Jack, I talked with him many years later and informed him of that. He was very upset. Jack had never received the files, had no idea they had come to him. At the New York Times, it was slightly different and points to another issue of the time. Wicker was a columnist by that time, and so when he opened it and saw what it was, he gave it to the reporter at the Times, Fred Graham, who covered the FBI. And he said, here, you cover the FBI, it may be more appropriate for you to have this. And Fred Graham's reaction was to call the FBI and say, we're giving these to you. But he apparently copied them because the day after our story ran, and he ran, on that same day, he ran a story describing the fact that the Attorney General said that no one should write a story about the files, but then after our story ran, he did write a story. And I just want to point out that what happened at the New York Times points to an atmosphere that it's helpful to understand, and that is that there really was no oversight. There was no official oversight of intelligence agencies until then by Congress or by the administration, even though attorney generals were technically the boss, the director of the FBI. But there also was no oversight in terms of investigative reporting by journalists, which of course is what led to the decision to do what we did.
So before we move on, I just wanted to emphasize that there were 1,000 files that were copied, and it was a tremendous amount of information. And this tiny, small town, Media, Pennsylvania, on the suburbs of Philadelphia. So this was not the main headquarters of the FBI. The information that was gleaned from this burglary was somewhat specific. So you talk about Swarthmore College. Swarthmore, of course, is in that region. And every single black student at Swarthmore had their very own informant. How lucky were they? Were these students accused of, or was there any reason to believe that they might be a danger or a threat? What was it about these students that, aside from their blackness?
That points to a very important issue in almost all the files that were about African Americans. No, it was all black students. And some of the other files, and I should say that although there was a focus in some of the files on local investigations, in fact, those files also describe the fact that the same investigation were the same practices were being used all over the country. There were other files that described the surveillance, blanket surveillance, in as much in that low-tech time as there could be. Blanket surveillance was taking place in African American communities in Philadelphia, which had a very large African American population. And they described, in the files of FBI officials, described the fact that black people were to be surveilled wherever they might go. For instance, I mean, these specific places were listed. In their communities, they might come under surveillance at the corner store, at bars, at restaurants, in their libraries, high school classrooms, college classrooms, libraries, churches. All those things were listed. Plus the fact that every FBI agent in the country was required to hire an informer who would report to him on a continuing basis on the activities of black people, except in Washington, D.C., where every agent was required to hire 6 informers who reported to him on a constant basis. Now, to get to the heart of your question, asking about the students, that my answer is going to apply not only to those students, but also to all of the black people who were under surveillance. They weren't interested. This was black people in general. It wasn't people who were under suspicion of crime. To J. Edgar Hoover, to be black was to be considered dangerous. And so it was a kind of blanket surveillance. We are watching black people without regard for whether or not we think they're committing a crime. So therefore, every black student on the campus would come under surveillance, no matter what you knew about it.
And then one final question before we move on to Mr. Harold Taylor. J. Edgar Hoover had something that was called his security index. For all of these people that were being surveilled, they were kept in this index. And in your book you talk about 5,500 members of the Society of Former FBI Agents who would possibly be enlisted to use that index in the event of a national emergency. And what would that index be used for in the event of a national emergency?
The security index the names have been added to it in a just continuous way, beginning in the 1920s. Hoover had been FBI director since 1924, almost a half century by the time the burglary takes place. And they just continually added the names of the people that they thought were dangerous, and if there was a national emergency, that they would be detained, not have access to habeas corpus, and be detained indefinitely by the FBI. This list had been had another name before. It was the security index, and years later, after the burglary, he would give it yet another name. He would rename programs out of fear that someone might discover that with the name of a program. If you change the name and someone asked about the security index, they say, no, there's no such program, when in fact it existed. Once an attorney general found out about this program and told him to end it, and he said he did, and he did not. He simply changed the name and said, no, that no longer exists.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that information and for doing such an awesome job documenting this story. I urge every single one here to please buy this book and read it. Now we're going to move on to Mr. Harold Taylor. Now, so far, the stories that have been shared with us, while disturbing, I would say they pale in comparison to what Mr. Harold Taylor has to say. There's an old saying in the black community, when the rest of America has a cold, the black community has pneumonia. And I think you can tell why just by what Ms. Medsger has shared, when you have your very own informant following you everywhere when you're not even suspected of anything just for being black. So Harold Taylor, Harold is a former member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And Harold, you were in Louisiana, and we want to pick your story of where you were arrested in Louisiana for one thing, but somehow you ended up being held on the 6th floor. And I'm going to let you go ahead and begin the story from there.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank these ladies here because of the work that they've done in that burglary. I could have never done it because I never would have been lit in the neighborhood. But at the same time, they did something that not only changed a lot of lives, they also saved lives. Mine particularly because of my experiences in the party and my commitment to my community, and make sure that the community and people in this country understood that the black community has always been treated like a people that's being enforced, being occupied, in the occupied territory, and that we had no rights that we were bound to respect. So the things that's happening today, the things that were always happening in the black community. We just didn't get the news as fast then as we get it now. But anyway, my story not only starts in New Orleans, but I can't tell that part without telling this part. okay, because I'm a citizen. And I was born and raised in Los Angeles, South Central LA. I'm 66 years old now, and I was 19 years old when I joined the party. And it changed my life completely because I'm a different kind of cat now. But at the same time, I was arrested in a COINTELPRO trap that they put together to arrest me and two other people. And what happened was that an FBI informant called my house, who was supposed to be a loyal member of the party, and gave me a bunch of lies about some information and stuff that he had for me that Elmer Geronimo Pratt wanted me to have. He told me when I meet him somewhere to he'd give it to me. So I called Geronimo's brother and told him that, asked him about this guy. He said, "Oh, he's good, you can go pick that up." But when I went, he didn't live there. And when I was getting ready to leave, I noticed that headlights were coming on all around it, on the street. There was a police car on each corner, in the rear, in the east and the west. And so when I got back into the car with my other comrades, we were getting ready to leave, the police car got behind us. And then as we was going down the street, I told Ray, who was the driver of the car, do not stop where it's dark. Make sure we get in the light where everybody could see. We already knew that somebody was doing something. It wasn't the police because they weren't smart enough. And there were bigger hands involved in this, And when we got to, we was going down Hooper. It was around 60, we left 50-something in Hooper going down towards Edison Junior High School. And I told Ray, don't turn on this street. Really turn right here where all these street lights are. And I think that was Gage. I haven't been over there in a long time. But yes, I did. I went over to show Hank where we got shot up at. Well, they pull us over. Police come up to the car. It's about, you can see shadows and silhouettes in the background. We can see a lot of people moving and flashing around. And one cop got to my window, and one other cop on the driver's side, I was the passenger side, in the rear. He hit the back of the trunk of the car, expecting for me to turn around and look and see what's going on, which I didn't do. It was an old trick that we already knew about the police. And when I didn't do that, when I looked up, the other cop was at the window and he had his gun out. He kept hollering at me to put my hands on the front seat. I told him my hands are on the front seat. I knew what to do. First of all, I'm not going to tell you I didn't have a gun, because at that time they were killing Black Panthers like it wasn't nothing. This is only a couple of years after Bunchy Carter and John Huggins were killed at UCLA, and which I was very close to them too. But at the same time, they had killed a couple of people in San Diego. John Savage and Sylvester Bell was killed by the US organization. COINTELPRO was involved in both of those killings. All four of them, as a matter of fact. So when I turned around and I told him my hands were on the seat, he kept screaming that that I was lying. And I just felt he was going to shoot me. So I turned my head, and no sooner I turned my head, a flash came by my eyes. I got my gun. When I got my gun, I turned back around. He had shot me in the leg. And I threw my leg up. He shot again. He missed, and I shot him. So the shooting thing was, it wasn't a shootout, it was a shoot-in, because they were doing all the shoot. It turned out it was something like 5 or 6 cops, about 8 cops back there behind us. And they shot into that old Bonneville. It was a 58 Bonneville, which was like a tank. They shot in that car about 250 times, something like that. And we were all arrested. We were all shot up. I was shot 6 times. Ray Boudreaux was shot 4. And John Bowman was shot in the back. And he's deceased now. But anyway, we went to jail just in 1971. Just full swing of COINTELPRO. And they had discovered those papers. We didn't know that. But we were in jail. They was going to prosecute us. We knew we wasn't going to get a fair trial. But we did get out of jail. They didn't know how we got out, because $25,000 is a lot of money, especially back then. And each one of our bails was $25,000. So we got out, and we knew we wasn't going to get a fair trial. So we jumped bail, and we ran. And I stayed in Los Angeles for a long time. And then I moved down to New Orleans to catch up with John Bowman and Ray Boudreaux. I was only there for a few days when FBI arrested us. I thought I heard a noise from a van down the street, like a police radio, you know. But I didn't investigate. I didn't follow my first thought, which was to leave. But I didn't leave, and so they arrested me there. They took us to jail in New Orleans, where they began to beat and torture us. They beat us from Friday. Well, Reuben Scott was already there. He was the third person. He was a 18-year-old kid at the time. And they had him already in a room where they'd been beating him, where he had urinated on himself. And, you know, he was all, you know, fetus was all over him. And he was bleeding, and he was crying. And he was afraid. He was shaking. They put me in there with him for the psychological effect for me to see him, to see what they've done to him. And they told me when they brought me out immediately and said, this is what you're going to get if you don't cooperate. I told them I didn't know anything. One thing about the FBI, they always write everything down. So when they took me in front of the FBI, I told them I didn't want to talk to nobody without a lawyer. They wrote it down and said he doesn't want to talk on it, the time and date and place. But then they turned me over to New Orleans police. And the next thing I know, there's New York police, there's San Francisco police, there's LA police. They were all jockeying for position to question us. But New Orleans was the police, the designated ones to do the beating and the torture, which consists of no sleep, nothing to eat, no water, and they beat you before they even asked you a question. They softened you up. And then when they took me to the room and told me to talk to these investigators, when I went in there, I told them I still want a lawyer, you know. So the door just flew open and they drugged me out, drugged me down a gauntlet. They stomped and kicked me. That was about during the time that Mark Exes was on. A lot of you guys, they won't talk about him on the Discovery Channel. He was on top of the Howard Johnson Hotel in New Orleans where he shot numerous police officers. And they was claiming that we were part of that group. So they beat us, they beat me, they beat JB, they beat Reuben. And neither one of us would talk to him. Reuben had made statements to him, and they made Reuben say things that wasn't true. And basically they wanted us to lie on other members of the party. And we wouldn't do it. But by that Sunday, this was a Friday when this first started. By that Sunday, it was getting even worse. They had already started using a plastic bag over your head, where they let you just about suffocate and then snatch it off so you get some air. And they would then they came with a cattle prod, where they would take it and stick it on private parts of your body, which gave you a shocking sensation. And beatings, and no sleep and nothing to eat, no water. And this continued until I agreed that Monday, John Bowman had already agreed to make his statements. And Reuben Scott had made statements from day one. But I was the last one that they wanted statements out. I wanted to hold out until we got to court. That's what's so important about habeas corpus. That's why habeas corpus don't exist anymore as far as this country is concerned. They took that away. They don't have to produce you in front of a judge within 72 hours. But then they had to. But they did produce me there, and I've been talking to some other inmates, telling them what they were doing, and they said they was going to tell the judge. And I got, all right, yeah, you're going to tell the judge. But they did. When the judge found out we were up there, which was, when the guy told him his family was there, and the courtroom had a lot of people there, so it was hard for the judge to deny we existed. And he told the public defender, and the public defender instantly demanded that we be brought in front of the judge. And on the way down, I was promised that they would beat my ass, that's their words, from the 6th floor to the 1st floor. If I say anything in that courtroom, they're going to beat my butt until I get back up to the 6th floor. Then it's going to be back on again.
That's them telling you not to stop talking.
Well, they already know all this stuff. But anyway, after that happened, I decided that on the way back up, the judge had told them to not question me no more, none of us anymore without a lawyer being present. They gave me a public defender, and said that we would not be remanded over to Sheriff Department. We were going to stay in the custody of the city police because at that time they had an old jail there in New Orleans called Parish Prison.
Okay, Harold, excuse me, I want to emphasize this. Yeah. The judge heard that you had been tortured.
Right.
And then sent you right back.
Right.
With the torturers.
Right. They gave him
You hear this?
They gave him a story that we were going to escape from Parish Prison because it was an old prison, which was really a slave quarters. At the time they used to bring slaves and sell them. Me and JB found that really ironic we ended up there, you know. But he said we would escape because there were people that was going to come and break us out. That we were part of a group that was supposed to be on a thing about killing police officers, which wasn't true. But it was anything they wanted to do. That's what they labeled us as. But it got back. They said the judge kept us, let them keep us over there with them, because he was afraid that we might get out. So from the first floor to the sixth floor, I was beaten again, and taken back up, and I was put under the bag again, and the blankets and everything else. Waterboarding is not very new to me because they use blankets instead of just holding your head down. They put you in a hot blanket, put it over your head, and then pour water over it. And you chain your ankles to the chair, you chain it with your hands to the chair. So you can't get out of it, and it's hot, and you can't breathe, and when you suck in to breathe, you pull in the blanket, and the water in the blanket is going down your throat, and you feel like you're drowning. So they did that until I agreed. I said, well, what do you want me to say? Just tell me what you want me to say, and I'll say it. So when I did say it, it still beat me. So, but anyway, that's what happened in New Orleans. From there, they made me make statements. They told me to say things about something, an event that happened in San Francisco where a group of black men had ran into a police station and killed a police officer. And I'm going to let Hank Jones tell you about how that started with the San Francisco 8. This all happened in '71.
Thank you so much, Harold. You know, people wouldn't believe that this is what goes on in America. And eventually, the case against you was dismissed because you confessed as a result of torture. So I just wanted to let you know, how did he get out of that? Because of the torture, the case was dismissed. Now we're going to go on to the year 2003, post 9/11. After 9/11, the United States created a new department, the Department of Homeland Security, and Congress instituted the Patriot Act. And as a result of that, there were new powers that the government had that had an impact, and you heard Harold talking about habeas corpus, and that had an impact on the way that domestic terrorists would be treated. So I'm going to let Mr. Hank Jones talk to you about what happened in 2003. Bear in mind, this is still connected to the earlier 1971 incident with Harold Taylor.
Yeah, I'd like to preface this by saying that COINTELPRO was an illegal and unconstitutional operation directed by the head of the FBI, Edgar Hoover. And this was the illegal and unconstitutional status of the program was determined by the Senate Church Committee hearings. And it was ordered to be discontinued and disbanded. But like Betty was saying, Hoover just changed the names of things. And that's the way they operate. They have just changed the names of things. And so COINTELPRO still exists under Homeland Security and USA Patriot Act. The practices still continue to today. The surveillance that we were under in the 70s has just, increased actually. They found new and more, better ways to do it. So, in 2003, after having watched the Twin Towers go down, got a feeling, uneasy feeling that might be hearing from the FBI again. And then sure enough, in 2003, I was sitting in my office at home and I looked out and an SUV pulled up across the street. Two guys got out. And as one got out, I saw his jacket flap open. He had a shoulder holster. So I said, well, it's here, And the reason I had this uneasy feeling was that in 1971, in San Francisco, the two lead detectives that oversaw the torture of Harold Taylor and Reuben Scott and John Bowman in New Orleans were the lead detectives on the case of the homicide in San Francisco. It's Ingleside Police Station. And they had investigated different radical organizations, and these two detectives finally settled on the Black Panther Party, the San Francisco chapter of the Black Panther Party. And they drew up a list of names, and I had seen my name on that. We got a copy of the list, and I had seen my name on that list. And so, I knew that we were being surveilled and that we had been infiltrated and that there were agent provocateurs in the park. We always assumed that anyway. But we didn't know the extent of the FBI's activities until the burglars exposed COINTELPRO. And we only learned about that in like the name and what all that meant in like 1975. So in 2003, these folks show up, and they want to come in. I'm curious. I want to know what they want to know. So I let them in. I don't advise anybody to talk to the FBI or the police without a lawyer, okay? But I'm curious, so I let them in. They came in and they started out by asking me if I knew any white people. I'm born and raised in the United States, in Mississippi, all that. So I said, I knew a few. And then one of the detectives, his name was Earl Latz, he leans back in his chair and crosses his legs. See, you got a nice home here. I hate to see you lose all this. All of this, we can make all of this go away if you just cooperate with us. And I said, I didn't say that. I was thinking, well, this is not my home. This is my wife's home. It's not in my name. And so I really am not concerned about that. But he said, hate to see you, if you don't cooperate, then I promise you, you will spend the rest of your life in Pelican Bay. And I don't like being threatened. So when he said that, my whole attitude changed toward the man. And the other guy was an FBI agent. And Then he started asking me about my associations with it. Did I know any Weather Underground people? And that was a white radical organization back in the 60s and 70s. And then he asked me if I had ever been a member of the Black Panther Party, and started asking me about different people I had associated with. So then I stopped the conversation, and I thought, you know, I told him that I thought if they had any further questions for me, that they needed to get legal documentation. And I immediately contacted a lawyer. Well, they came back with legal documentation. It was a subpoena to appear before a secret grand jury in San Francisco, and that was 2005. And I get to San Francisco, and no, they showed me the subpoena. And on the subpoena, they're accusing me of being a domestic terrorist, a member of the Black Liberation Army, who they had by then designated retroactively as domestic terrorists under Homeland Security Authority. The lead, I forgot to mention, the lead detective was Erlatz had come out of retirement, and his partner McCoy, there were two of them, had come out of retirement and been deputized as Joint Terrorist Task Force agents for the FBI.
So wait, can you emphasize who are these two people?
These are the two that oversaw the torture, Harold and John Bowman and Reuben Scott in New Orleans in 1973. So I had never met them. I had just heard their names. They had been looking for me in the past, and my mother had told me, well, these two nice officers came by, Mr. McCoy and Mr. Erlatz, and they wanted to ask us, you know, but I knew about them from that. Anyway, went before the secret grand jury, and this one happened to be a federal magistrate, because they were accusing me of being a domestic terrorist, and so that was like a federal offense, you see. So they took me for a federal magistrate. But my lawyer, who was a Harvard law professor, you know, immediately got that squashed, and it went away because there was no jurisdiction over me, and I was not a domestic terrorist. There's no way they could make that stick. So they kicked it out of federal authority or court, and put it into state court. And we're going to try us for the murder of this police officer and 11 other conspiracy charges. And over that, they said spanned 5 years, you know, of activity. So they, you know, they had dredged up every unsolved crime they could find, and you know, they were going to try to pin all that on us. And Jerry Brown, who was Attorney General, was going to head up the prosecution. He designated his assistant, what's the guy's name? Drew Liner, yeah, Drew Liner, to actually do the court appearances and stuff. Jerry had his eye on the governorship, so he was pretty busy. Drew Liner has his eye on becoming some kind of a judge or something, Supreme Court judge or something. So they thought if they could prosecute this case, it would be a feather in the hat. But how much time do I have?
Okay, so let me just see. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't. Okay, so thank you, Carol. Hank. What it all boiled down to, he was charged. They tried to recharge them for a crime that they didn't commit in 1971. It's the same crime. And it was dismissed.
It was, in 2005, we resisted the grand jury, the secret grand jury, because we said it was unlawful and unconstitutional. And so we were thrown in jail for contempt of the grand jury. But then when we got out, when the grand jury term expired, and they miscalculated because it was only like 6 weeks before it expired, and they could have reinstalled another grand jury and done it again, but they didn't. We went around the country and started telling the story about the fact that the case was a torture case, and that these brothers had been tortured in New Orleans, and we had sessions like this all over the country and built up a support committee.
So as a result, they're here now. So they did not serve any significant amount of time. However, there are many others that lost their lives, lost their homes, lost their jobs. There are some people that are behind bars right now, today, because of COINTELPRO. The torturers who were responsible for what happened to Harold Taylor. There were no consequences. They were never held accountable. In fact, they were honored by being deputized and brought back so that they could show up again in 2003, 30-something years later, to continue to harass these men. So if you would, Hank, can you please talk about the number of political prisoners, that many of which are there because of COINTELPRO, that are still there today?
Yeah, this is a little booklet we put together, and it says over 800 years in captivity. That was the accumulated or total amount of time that Panther political prisoners had served when this was put out in last year before last. And there are now like 17 former Black Panther Party members who are political prisoners being held in this country. And this country refuses to acknowledge that there are political prisoners. They are being held there because of their political beliefs and their practices. And the fact that they refuse to, work for them, but turn their back on what they stood for and what they represented.
Right on.
So it would be great if we could give you all a copy of this. It tells the story of each one in here, and it's kind of a before and after photo of them, photo when they were arrested, and current photo of them as they do this time. We work constantly trying to get them out, and get them released. So,
So I'd like to thank our panelists, but I want to urge everyone here to, first of all, to be encouraged, because sometimes it does seem hopeless. The work and the courage and the risks that were taken in 1971 were not all for naught. Even though the COINTEL program morphed into other things, and even though we have the Patriot Act, still, the work that was done by John and Bonnie Raines and the other members of this Citizens Commission, that work helped to save lives, really helped to save lives. Who knows if Harold wouldn't be alive today had that not come out. And it helped to save them when they went to trial in 2003. So I just say that to say that there is always hope, and the work is not easy, and it's long, And Harold wants to say one more thing, and then after Harold says one more thing, then we're going to have an opportunity for you to pick up a book, pick up this surveillance report, sign the card, or fill out a card that says that you're willing to participate in helping us to get rid of these surveillance efforts in our police department. So let's let Harold say one more thing, and then we'll line up for the book.
Sorry.
I just wanted to add something in case you guys are wondering whatever happened to the case I had with shooting a police officer. I eventually went to trial at a jury, and they found it self-defense. And I was really... They had to drop the charges against Boudreaux and Bowman. And also that in 1975, the same murder that they charged us with in 2003, they had charged me with it in 1975. And the district attorney failed to inform the grand jury that torture was involved, that all that evidence that they claimed they had was inadmissible because of the torture. And the district attorney in Los Angeles admitted that we were tortured. And so they had to drop it then. But then they came back after the trials went down and reopened the case and told me that the case was overturned. That the evidence that was kicked out was now admissible, and that they was going to take me back, and that I could help myself by helping them, you know. And I just want to say that if they're asking you questions, they don't know, you know. And so when they keep doing it, they didn't know anything, and they were fishing. It was a fishing expedition, and we suffered at the hands of the cruelty of this country when it wants to be cruel. As great a country it could be an awful place at the same time. So that's right.
So, all right, so now,
So we will be taking questions. I don't know if you need a mic. Ella, you want to? Justin, let me see if I can hear you.
Bonnie, can you talk about your decision to go public as one of the burglars? And I know these statute of limitations have run out by that time, but since you've gone public, have you experienced any intimidation or?
Well, our agreement as a group of the 8 of us agreed that after we accomplished what we hoped we would accomplish, depending on other people to keep this moving forward, that we would not associate with each other again, talk to each other again, and simply try to go back to our regular lives and hope that the 200 agents in the Philadelphia area weren't going to catch up with us. So we did that. We just did not talk about it for 40 years. We didn't expect we would ever be telling the story. And then it came out in a rather interesting and almost accidental way, but it seemed that there was a lot of interest in the story because of the parallels, particularly because of the parallels about what is going on today, and questions about whistleblowers that are such important questions. So we agreed to work with Betty and the filmmaker and locate the other members of the group to see if they would be willing to have their stories told. And they were, and we're hoping that it's beneficial in terms of getting messages out there. And also hoping, and we have not been contacted by the FBI, I should say. No, we have not. And we hope that there's a little bit of inspiration about what one can do as an ordinary citizen if you take your responsibilities as a citizen seriously. And so that's one of the reasons we're trying to get some hope going and fight cynicism today.
I think transparency is very important. I'm glad you guys came forward. You just mentioned that the FBI has not contacted you. Do any of you feel that they would have been contacted if these have been black people who spoke?
We've been asked that question also, and it's quite,
It's repeated for those, did everyone hear the question?
No.
The question was that I said that we have not been contacted by the FBI, and her question was, if we had been black, do we think we would have been pursued by the FBI, even up till this time? And I think it's entirely possible that it could have played out that way and been a very, very different kind of story. I hope that if that had happened, that we could depend on organizations like the ACLU to take up our defense. And it's extremely important to form defenses around these kinds of abuses of power that can still happen, and happen to a much greater extent to African Americans.
Bonnie?
So I got to Philly in 1972 as a graduate student, and by the mid-70s, I was kind of going around Philly handing out communist papers to anybody who would take them. And I would say about 40% of the black men I approached in Philly in 1975 say, communist, oh, that's great. I used to be a member of the Black Panther Party. And it got to the point where I said, the Black Panther Party could not possibly have had that many members in Philadelphia. And then what I realized is, it probably didn't, but it had a massive base of support in the community. And I think, to me, the lesson today is that we need to rely on the masses of people to carry out a fundamental change, not where we're kind of trying to keep them from surveilling us, but where we're running things. Let's just say it, this country needs a revolution worse now than even in the 70s.
Well,
That's true too.
I would say certainly another movement, certainly that.
What are the most effective ways that these political prisoners could be released? Is it going to be through like a state-by-state basis through the court system? Or like the lady said, through a mass movement? I understand there was mass movements of these political prisoners in the 1990s, the Jericho movement, etc. And that was shut down after September 11th. So what are the strategies we can use today that are going to be effective to get these people released?
Last time I talked to people in New York City, that's part of the Jericho movement. It's still out there. It's still working. It's still pushing. And as far as getting political prisoners free, it's only you guys can help us do that. You know, the people's got to come together and work in the behalf of political prisoners. They've done their job, you know, and they're your elders, really. You can learn a lot of things from them. Leonard Peltier has a lot to say. He was framed for a murder that he had nothing to do with, 2 FBI agents. And he's been in there forever. You know, you got so many different political prisoners up there. But if you guys were to support political prisoners and unite around any one particular one that you can relate to and communicate with them and make sure that you let your senator know that they need to reopen the committee, reopen that COINTELPRO program, because they need to find out the things that the FBI was doing and how there's never, ever been anybody sent to prison for killing a member of the Black Panther Party. Even when they murdered Fred Hampton in his bed, killed Mark Clark. Nobody has never been to prison for that. And they framed Black Panthers from one coast to the other coast. And they got them sitting there and they've been warehoused. You know, I try to condense things, but it's so much I can say, but I don't want to take up all the time. I'm gonna let
We have a couple more, we have one here, and then we're going to...
Thank you, Sharon.
I just want to speak to that too. But, we are, there are strategies in place that we're using now to try to free political prisoners. But what we need to do is like have a reopening of COINTELPRO hearings, because we need a structural change in this country, in this so-called democracy. We were talking today, black people have never realized democracy in this country. And neither have you, if you think about it, any of you. We haven't tried democracy, So we need to change a movement to bring about a change in the way the system functions, where we value human lives over the bottom line.
Certainly. Betty, you mentioned earlier the importance of the Church Commission, Senator Frank Church from Idaho, Democrat. You mentioned the importance of Black Panther Party involvement as a basis for political emergence. Bobby Rush, certainly a member of Congress from Illinois, a former member of the Black Panther Party. You mentioned the sharing of the documents with Democratic members of Congress. I wanted to ask any member of the panel to speak particularly to the strategic value of relationships with Democratic members of the Congress and the Senate, all members of Congress and Senate, but particularly the responsibility and the value of oversight by Democratic members of Congress and the Senate. Here we are on the brink of filling our Senate seat here in California. Barbara Boxer, a former journalist and a senator who exerted great oversight and has not been afraid to shine a light on problems of the kind that we've talked about tonight. Can any of you speak to the particular value and responsibility and the standards to which we need to hold Democratic elected officials particularly to look into the specific kinds of problems you've discussed here and the kinds of standards we should set for the reaction and responsiveness that we expect of those officials?
Well, let's go back a minute in history, because one of the things Hoover was able to do was to tell Americans what they should be afraid of. And he could define that for us, and we accepted that. And in the 50s and 60s, it was communism. And if you were called soft on communism, you would not be elected to office, and you probably would be persecuted. We now have another time in history when we're being told what we need to be afraid of, and that is the terrorism threat. And I'm not saying that there aren't dangers. There are dangers that we have to be aware of and pay attention to. But we're being told to be afraid, and then we're being told that we know what it's going to take to protect you from those terrorists, and it's going to be secret surveillance. And I think our members of Congress have looked the other way so far, and I think that they need to be held more responsible for some new legislation that is going to rein in that surveillance, which is so often illegal, certainly very, very unnecessary and destructive. So that's a whole conversation, and I think those members of Congress, even some of the more progressive ones, have lost their backbone, and the last thing they want to be called is soft on terrorism, because then they would lose their elected office.
We talk of oversight. We don't have consequences for the actions of these people that supposedly represent us and then sell us out or serve their own self-interest or sell out to the highest bidder. There are no consequences. We need oversight with consequences if you do not perform up to your duties and responsibility to the general public. Otherwise, nothing's going to change. We're not locking any of these people up. We're not, voting them out of office. We're not engaged in the process enough. There needs to be a debt to paid for, the kind of criminality that's going on. And they're a bunch of lying, thieving, murdering crooks.
Oh, yeah.
I've watched the things like the Patriot Act come into being, the National Defense Authorization Act, and it's like a juggernaut. It just keeps going and going and going. And us as individual humans become worth much less as time goes by, and these authoritarian, totalitarian behaviors become more entrenched, more acceptable. And I'm wondering, is it going to take a real effort to blow back to the root of this lie, to expose 9/11 for the unbelievable and impossible lie that it is? Because that's the root of it. And 9/11 is a lie. And maybe half the people in here don't believe that, but they just haven't done the research of it. Because this is the basis that gives us all these acts coming down the line, and it gets worse and worse, become less and less valuable, and you ask them what end? Well, I shudder to think of what end. It seems like an end that's going to be like the Nazi end.
Thank you for that comment. I think that if we engage in that, we'll be here all night long.
Well, what's it
We're
going
gonna-
to take to blow it back? Give me a short answer.
I have to say that we don't have a short answer to what it's going to take.
Well, a few people do.
We're going to take, let's see, 1, 2, 3 more questions, but we want to make sure that we get a question asked by a student. So please, is there a student here who has a question? Is there a student with a question? Oh, student of life? Okay. Oh, there's a student with a question.
I just have a quick question for Bonnie and Betty. I don't know, whoever wants to answer this, but how did you, the group of 8, choose the journalists and the congressman that you gave the files to? Because I'm pretty sure it wasn't random. There was a strategy to it. So what was your decision-making process for that?
Well, we chose 2 so-called liberal members of Congress because we thought we could count on them to see something that was terribly important to reveal to the American public. We chose 3 very prominent newspapers. At the Washington Post, we directed the documents to Betty because we had known Betty previously when she was a reporter in the with the Philadelphia newspaper, and we respected her journalism. We knew she was reporting on the anti-war movement, and we thought that she would take the responsible path and work as hard as she could to get that information out because the public deserved that information. So the Post came through for us, and that was a good thing.
Hi. I wanted to just, first of all, compliment you on your very badassness. I mean, really, it's amazing, it's stunning. And I worked in journalism, and today the state of affairs of journalism and the infiltration of whatever's happening in journalism is a sorry state of affairs. So congratulations. And my question is, if you were to say one thing, what would one small piece of the puzzle be to start the ball rolling? Is it gathering community? Is it getting hold of your congressperson? Is it, what would you say if you were to say, let's make a difference starting right now?
Andy's raring to go. I think as far as journalists are concerned and the public is concerned, and I think the public is an enormous piece of this, and the public did not react when Edward Snowden's files came out the way the public reacted then. And I think that needs to be a deep concern of people who want to cause change. And I think pay attention, which obviously a lot of people are, pay attention and ask questions, and try to demand answers of the people who have the power.
Okay, one more final question. Tim.
I'm just wondering, you were saying that you're acquitted on self-defense charges. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on, like, how did you go about choosing your attorneys that were defending you? Because I'm wondering, was it your public defender or who helped choose the attorney?
This attorney, her name was Beth Lipsy and Carol K. Smith. My preference was a woman. Johnny Cochran was originally appointed my case, but at the time he was working on Geronimo Pratt's case. And I told him that he had his hands full dealing with that, and he wouldn't have time in the time I wanted him to take on my case. So these 2 ladies volunteered, and I asked the court to appoint Beth Lipsy as my attorney. I wanted a woman because I come from a woman, and I know what a black woman would do and any woman would do when it comes to their child, is that they're going to protect them. and they will fight for. And I always believe that one thing the party always taught us, we got to win the hearts and minds of the community. That's the base. They always supported us. And because we brought things to the table that the government has stolen from us. The free breakfast program was our idea. Free health clinics was our idea. The sickle cell anemia thing was our idea. You know, free legal advice was our idea. You know, it wasn't like we was a bunch of gun-toting maniacs like they were trying to portray us. But see, I didn't join the Black Panther Party to attack anybody. I joined the Black Panther Party because I wanted to defend my community and represent my community. And I think what's wrong with young people today, they become insensitive to the needs of the people. And so we always believe that you put yourself behind the people because you're going to be working for them. And don't ever forget who you work for. That's why we always stressed after we left the party, the ones that did, that we would not have no leadership. You kill one leader and the whole thing falls apart. So there's no leadership, no leaders. But we lead by example, but always never forget who you work for. People like Huey Newton kind of forgot that. And they became opportunists, and they became gangsters, you know. So principles, there's certain things I will do and certain things I'm not going to do. You know, I live by my principles, and I'm committed to my comrades and to my friends and to justice for all people. I'm not a racist, so I never had a problem with that. You know, even at the age of 19 years old, you know, but I didn't have sense enough to be afraid, you know.
Okay, so thank you so much. Medsger, Sharon Kyle, Bonnie Williams, and Betty Medsger. Betty, did you want to say one more thing?
Just one thing I would like to say. You've certainly had from Harold and Hank a strong idea of one aspect of COINTELPRO. I'd like to tell you just a bit more about COINTELPRO because it was such an important and awful program and how it came about that it was discovered. COINTELPRO, it turned out, was one of the worst operations that J. Edgar Hoover ever invented, and there were quite a few. We didn't know anything about COINTELPRO. One of the files that came out of the media office was just a mere routing slip that was attached to a newspaper article on advising how college administrators should deal with professors and students who were protesting the war. And this routing slip up in the upper right-hand corner had in block letters, big block letters, the term COINTELPRO. And none of us who received it knew what it meant. I wrote something about what it said at the bottom and how this article should be distributed with the FBI writing anonymous letters to unfriendly college administrators when they distributed it to them. And when I did that, J. Edgar Hoover realized for the first time that the term was outside the FBI and was very, very upset about that. And a few weeks later, again, a gamesmanship with words, they removed the name of the program. The program continued, but it no longer had the name in case anyone asked. As they did start asking, a year later, we said that program doesn't exist. What happened was that a little more than a year later, another journalist, Carl Stern, saw that routing slip in a Senate office, and he decided to, thank goodness, to find out exactly what that was. And he asked the FBI and the Justice Department, and they refused to explain it, and said this would endanger national security, endanger lives, just as they had said to us about writing about the file. And he didn't settle for that, and he kept pursuing it, and finally he sued. And by the end of 1973, a judge ordered the FBI to provide him with what he was asking for, which was simply the founding document, what Hoover had written, defining what COINTELPRO was. And it described a series of highly secret operations that were intended to harass, distort, destroy individuals and organizations with opinions and activities that he disapproved of. And his idea of subversive was an extremely wide range. It could range from somebody simply writing a letter to the editor of their newspaper expressing an opinion, a mild opinion against the war, you know, all the way over to what he considered the worst, which was someone in the Communist Party. And of course, in between, the Black Panther Party had a plan for destroying it. But it ranged, thousands and thousands of people were attacked through COINTELPRO operations. None of it had anything to do with law enforcement. None of it had anything to do with intelligence gathering. It was simply meant to damage people and organizations. And to do so, it ranged from what I call crude to cruel. And you've heard some of the cruel, the very cruel things. The crude part, having FBI agents and informers inject orgies of activists with strong laxatives, hiring prostitutes known to have venereal disease to seduce activists, and then over on the other side, kind of torture that you've heard about this evening, and also having an FBI informer give false testimony in court that convicted not only Geronimo Pratt, but that's a very important case, to convict Geronimo Pratt here in Los Angeles of a murder he didn't commit, and to serve 27 years in prison as a result of this. A conviction, a false conviction that was removed only a few years ago when the Orange County judge demanded that the FBI produce the exonerating evidence that would have avoided the entire case from the beginning. And also the murder of Fred Hampton, with an FBI informer who provided the information that was used by a Chicago shooter to kill Fred Hampton as he slept. And the FBI informer getting a letter of congratulations from the Washington office for having played that role and the financial reward for doing so. And then, of course, almost everyone knows another program was the one. And because this is Martin Luther King week, I would just like to draw particular attention to this. The FBI was after Martin Luther King as many years as he was an activist. Many attempts to destroy him, including the one that was discussed earlier in the evening, that the attempt to try to get him to commit suicide before he went to Norway to get the Nobel Peace Prize. As we honor him, it is just amazing that he survived as much as he did. They even were picking out the person that the FBI intended to replace him as the leader of black people, as though they, the people who had such incredible reasons and attitudes, should be the right people to do that.